While other fathers prayed for wealth and ease, this man's prayer for his newborn son horrified everyone in the room. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The air in the boardroom of Zenith Heights was chilled to a precise 18 degrees, a stark, expensive contrast to the humid Lagos sun vibrating against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Abina stood at the head of the mahogany table, his cufflinks catching the light like jagged diamonds as he gestured toward the holographic rendering of the silver-winged towers. He spoke with the rhythmic cadence of a man who had never been told no, his voice a smooth baritone that commanded the attention of investors from Dubai to London. To Abina, the city below wasn't a collection of lives and struggles, it was a canvas of concrete and steel waiting for his signature. He felt the weight of his Patek Philippe on his wrist, a constant, ticking reminder that time was his servant, and that he had successfully climbed the jagged mountain of Nigerian excellence to stand where the air was thin and the view was infinite. Every nod from the board members was a hit of dopamine, a confirmation that he was indeed the architect of the future, a title the magazines had bestowed upon him with breathless adoration. Later that evening, the celebration continued in the sprawling silence of his Ikoyi penthouse, where the scent of expensive oud lingered in the corridors like a ghost of wealth. Amara was waiting for him on the balcony, her silhouette framed by the shimmering lights of the Third Mainland Bridge, a queen in a kingdom of glass. As he wrapped his arms around her, the silk of his suit brushing against her skin, he didn't see the flicker of worry in her eyes or the way her smile didn't quite reach her soul. He was too busy narrating his own greatness, describing the deals signed and the rivals crushed, oblivious to the fact that his foundation was already beginning to groan under the weight of his arrogance. Amara leaned back into him, her silence a sanctuary he didn't yet realize he would soon desperately need, as the first invisible crack formed in the basement of the Silver Wing project, miles away and deep underground. The phone call came at 3 a.m., a jagged intrusion into a dream of soaring heights and golden triumphs. It was his lead site foreman, his voice trembling with a cocktail of fear and exhaustion that Abina found immediately distasteful. "Sir, the piling on Sector 4. It's shifting," the man stammered, the words hitting Abina like a physical blow to the stomach. He sat up, the Egyptian cotton sheets feeling suddenly abrasive against his skin, as the cold reality of the foreman's report began to settle. A shift in Sector 4 meant the entire northern elevation was compromised, a structural nightmare that could delay the project by a year and cost billions in liquidated damages. Abina looked at Amara, sleeping peacefully beside him, her breathing the only honest thing in the room, and felt a sudden, sharp surge of resentment, not at the building, but at the vulnerability this news forced upon him. He didn't tell her. He simply dressed in the dark, his movements frantic and graceless, a predator suddenly sensing the scent of his own blood in the water. At the sight, the floodlights cast long, distorted shadows against the skeletal frame of the towers, making the massive structure look like the ribcage of a dying beast. Abina stood at the edge of the excavation pit, the smell of damp earth and diesel fumes clogging his throat, staring at the laser levels that confirmed his worst fears. The soil was failing, a geological betrayal that his initial surveys, the ones he had rushed to meet the investor's deadline, had failed to predict. His mind raced, not toward a solution, but toward a cover-up, a way to patch the wound without anyone seeing the hemorrhage. He looked at the foreman, a man who had worked for him for a decade, and saw the expectation of integrity in the man's eyes. It was an expectation Abina was already preparing to betray. "We don't report this," Abina whispered, his voice sounding thin against the vastness of the construction site. "We reinforce it quietly, overnight, and we move on as if the earth itself is afraid to move against me." Quote, the decision to bypass the structural integrity board felt like a silent suicide, a quiet clicking of a chamber that Abina hoped was empty. He spent 3 days in a feverish haze of forged signatures and backdated invoices, his office door locked against the prying eyes of his junior architects who sensed the shifting tide. He began a dangerous dance with a local supplier of substandard reinforcement bars, men who dealt in the shadows of the Lagos ports and understood the price of silence. Every time his pen touched the paper to authorize the use of Grade B steel in a Grade A foundation, a small part of his conscience withered, replaced by a cold, calculating desperation. He told himself it was a temporary measure, a bridge over a gap that would eventually be filled by his own brilliance, ignoring the mathematical certainty that a lie told in concrete eventually speaks in the language of gravity. The silence in his office became a heavy, physical thing, punctuated only by the hum of the air conditioner and the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the mahogany desk, as he gambled the lives of thousands on a bluff that he was too proud to fold. Amara's presence at home became an irritant, a mirror reflecting a version of himself he no longer recognized. When she asked about the late nights and the sudden, sharp edges of his temper, he would retreat into a fortress of technical jargon and corporate stress, effectively shutting her out of his crumbling world. He began to see her kindness as a form of interrogation, her gentle touch as a trap designed to make him confess the rot he was hiding beneath his skin. One night, while he sat in the dark living room staring at the flickering lights of the city, she sat beside him and didn't say a word for an hour, her hand resting lightly on his knee. He wanted to scream, to tell her that the very bridge they were looking at was built on a foundation of his own deceit, but the words died in his throat, choked by the pride that had become his only remaining possession. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, yet he refused the life jacket of her love because it required him to admit he couldn't swim. Amara watched the man she loved turn into a stranger, a slow-motion metamorphosis that tasted like ash in her mouth. The Abina she knew was a man of light, a builder who saw the potential in every grain of sand, but this new version was a creature of shadows and sharp corners. She noticed the way he stopped praying before meals, the way he flinched at the sound of the morning news, and the way he began to hoard his phone like a forbidden relic. She began to find strange receipts in his pockets, transactions from companies she had never heard of, payments made in cash to names that sounded like aliases from a crime novel. Instead of confronting him with accusations that would only make him retreat further into his shell, she began to build a quiet fortress of prayer and preparation, sensing that a storm was coming that would blow their golden life into the sea. She didn't know the specifics of the structural failure, but she knew the structural failure of his soul, and she realized that being a wife in this season meant being the anchor even when the ship was intent on crashing into the rocks. Her friends at the Lagos Polo Club began to whisper, their sympathy appearing like a thin veil over their genuine excitement at a potential scandal. They asked her if Abina was feeling well, their eyes scanning her designer handbag for signs of wear, looking for the first cracks in the facade of the power couple. Amara handled them with a grace that was both a shield and a sword, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a single tear or a moment of doubt. Inside, however, the weight of the unknown was becoming an unbearable pressure, a constant humming in her ears that only stopped when she was alone in her garden, talking to the God she trusted even when she couldn't trust her husband. She began to quietly put aside small sums of money, selling her jewelry piece by piece under the guise of upgrading, creating a hidden safety net for a fall she hoped would never come but felt in her bones was inevitable. She was the silent sentinel of a crumbling empire, watching the man who built it burn the blueprints in a frantic attempt to keep the cold at bay. The end didn't come with a bang, but with a simple, 3-page PDF sent from an anonymous encrypted email address to the National Building Council. It was a comprehensive breakdown of the Sector 4 failure, complete with photographs of the substandard steel and copies of the forged signatures Abina thought he had buried. The whistleblower was his own lead foreman, the man whose integrity Abina had tried to buy with a promise of a promotion and a new car, but whose conscience had finally buckled under the weight of the potential body count. When the email hit the press, the reaction was instantaneous and violent. The Golden Boy of Lagos was transformed overnight into the Butcher of Echo Atlantic. Abina sat in his office as the police sirens wailed in the distance, watching the news ticker on the television screen scroll through his name with a clinical, detached horror. He felt a strange sense of relief, the kind a terminal patient feels when the diagnosis is finally spoken aloud, the exhausting effort of the life finally giving way to the cold, hard reality of the truth. The arrest was a public spectacle, a carefully choreographed piece of theater for a public hungry for the blood of the elite. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the cold metal biting into his wrists, Abina looked through the glass doors of his office and saw his staff, the people who had once looked at him with awe, now looking at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. He was led through the lobby, past the awards he had won and the models of the buildings he had designed, a fallen god being cast out of his own heaven. The cameras of the tabloid journalists flashed like strobe lights, capturing every detail of his disheveled hair and his hollow eyes, turning his private shame into a national entertainment. He looked for Amara in the crowd, half hoping she wouldn't be there to see him like this, and half terrified that she had already left him. But as he was pushed into the back of the police van, he saw her standing on the sidewalk, her face a mask of stoic calm, her eyes locked onto his with a message he wasn't yet ready to decode: "I am still here." The legal system in Nigeria is a labyrinth designed to consume those without the favor of the powerful, and Obinna found himself trapped in its dark, winding corridors. His friends in the government, the ones who had accepted his donations and toasted his success at gala dinners, suddenly suffered from a collective bout of amnesia. His assets were frozen within 48 hours, the bank accounts, the penthouse, the fleet of cars, and the very ground he stood on were all reclaimed by the state as part of the ongoing investigation. He went from drinking vintage cognac in Ikoyi to drinking lukewarm water from a plastic sachet in a detention cell that smelled of bleach and unwashed bodies. The transition was so rapid it felt like a dream, a nightmare from which he expected to wake up at any moment to the smell of Amara's coffee and the sound of the Atlantic waves. But the reality was the iron bars and the mocking laughter of the guards who took pleasure in reminding him that his money could no longer buy his way out of a dark room. Amara spent those first few weeks in a blur of meetings with expensive lawyers who demanded retainers she no longer possessed and old associates who refused to take her calls. She moved their belongings out of the penthouse in a single afternoon, the luxury furniture sold off for a fraction of its value to pay for Obinna's bail and the initial legal fees. She didn't complain when she had to pack her designer dresses into cheap plastic suitcases, nor did she flinch when the landlord of their new apartment, a cramped, two-room flat in a noisy suburb of the mainland, demanded 6 months' rent in advance. She learned the hard geometry of a budget, calculating the cost of every grain of rice and every liter of fuel, her life shrinking from the infinite horizons of wealth to the narrow walls of survival. When Obinna was finally released on bail, broken and silent, he walked into a home that felt like a tomb, only to find Amara waiting with a bowl of soup and a look that said their life hadn't ended, it had simply been stripped of its vanity. The move to the mainland was a physical manifestation of their social death, a journey across the bridge that felt like crossing the river Styx into the underworld. Their new neighborhood was a chaotic tapestry of open gutters, screaming generators, and the constant, rhythmic pounding of life lived at the edge of the blade. For Obinna, the noise was a constant assault on his dignity, a reminder of everything he had lost and the height from which he had fallen. He spent the first few weeks sitting on their second-hand sofa, staring at the peeling paint on the walls, his mind a shattered mirror reflecting his failures in agonizing detail. He couldn't go outside without feeling the weight of the neighbors' stares, their whispers of "that big man who stole money," following him like a physical stench. He was a man without a purpose, an architect whose only current project was the construction of his own misery, and he found himself hating the very air he breathed for being so cheap and so common. Amara, however, adapted with a ferocity that both intimidated and shamed him. She traded her silk scarves for cotton wrappers and her high heels for practical sandals, navigating the local markets with the focus of a general planning a campaign. She didn't have time for the luxury of depression, she had a husband to feed and a future to salvage from the wreckage of his pride. She started a small business from their kitchen, baking meat pies and selling them to the office workers at the nearby bus stop, her hands, once manicured and soft, now smelling of flour and hot oil. Obinna watched her from his corner of the room, feeling a toxic mix of gratitude and resentment that she was doing what he couldn't bring himself to do, accept their reality. Every time she handed him a plate of food, he felt the bite of the bread like a judgment, a reminder that the architect of the future was now being sustained by the labor of a woman he had spent years ignoring. The digital world was even more cruel than the physical one, with social media platforms becoming a 24-hour courtroom where Obinna was executed daily. Memes of his arrest circulated with ruthless efficiency, his face photoshopped onto the bodies of cartoon villains and corrupt officials, becoming a shorthand for the systemic rot of the nation. He made the mistake of checking his old Instagram profile once, seeing his former peers posting photos from the yachts he used to frequent, their captions filled with subtle jabs at integrity and sustainable growth. He realized then that he hadn't had friends, he had had audience members, and now that the show had turned into a tragedy, they were simply throwing tomatoes at the stage. The phone that used to ring every 5 minutes was now a silent, dead weight in his pocket, a relic of a life that no longer existed. He was a ghost haunting his own biography, a man who was famous for all the wrong reasons and forgotten for all the right ones. One afternoon, he encountered a former colleague at a local petrol station, a man he had once mentored and helped promote. The man looked at Abinna, his eyes taking in the faded t-shirt and the worn-out shoes, and then looked away as if he was staring at a pile of trash. He didn't even acknowledge Abinna's nod, instead turning to his driver and barking an order to hurry up so they could leave the dirty neighborhood. The sting of that rejection was sharper than any legal indictment. It was the final confirmation that Abinna's value had been entirely tied to his bank balance. He walked home in the pouring rain, the water soaking through his clothes and chilling him to the bone, feeling the weight of his invisibility like a heavy cloak. When he got back to the flat, he broke down for the first time, sobbing into Amara's lap as she stroked his hair and whispered that the world's opinion was a lie and that the only truth was the love that remained when the lights went out. The depression that followed was a thick, black tide that pulled Abinna under and held him there for months. He stopped shaving, stopped bathing, and eventually stopped speaking, retreating into a catatonic state where the only sign of life was the occasional twitch of his eyes. He saw himself as a structural failure, a building that had collapsed and killed everyone inside, and he felt that any attempt to rebuild would be a mockery of the lives he had risked. He spent his days in the darkened bedroom, the curtains drawn against the Lagos sun, listening to the sounds of Amara working in the kitchen, the rhythmic clinking of spoons, the hiss of the frying pan, the muffled conversations with customers. To him, her industry was a form of noise pollution, a jarring reminder that life was continuing even though he had decided to die. He felt a perverse comfort in his own darkness, a sense that he finally deserved the squalor he was living in, and that any light would only serve to highlight the extent of his decay. Amara didn't try to fix him with platitudes or empty encouragement. She simply existed alongside him, a quiet, steady flame in his cold basement. She would bring him water and wash his face with a warm cloth, talking to him about the small things, the price of flour, the neighbor's new baby, the way the rain sounded on the zinc roof. She was building a bridge of normalcy across the chasm of his despair, one small conversation at a time, refusing to let him disappear entirely into the void. There were nights when she would cry silently in the kitchen, her body shaking with the exhaustion of carrying 2 lives on her shoulders, but she never let him see her weakness. She knew that if she broke, he would be lost forever, and so she hardened her heart against her own pain, transforming it into a fuel that kept her moving through the endless, repetitive days. She was the architect now, designing a life of survival in the ruins of a life of luxury, and her foundation was made of a faith that Abinna had yet to discover. By the 6th month of their exile, Amara's meat pie business had expanded into a small catering service for the local schools. She was waking up at 4 a.m. every day, her hands covered in burns and her back aching from the hours spent over a kerosene stove, but her eyes had a clarity that Abinna found terrifying. She had become the breadwinner, the protector, and the spiritual center of their home, navigating the complexities of their new life with a competence that made his former boardroom triumphs look like child's play. She managed the aggressive debt collectors who still harassed them, she negotiated with the local, area boys, who tried to extort her business, and she did it all while maintaining a dignity that even the most expensive designer clothes couldn't have provided. She was no longer just the wife of a great man, she was a great woman who happened to be married to a broken man, and the shift in power was as undeniable as it was painful for Abinna to witness. One evening, she came home with a small, wrapped gift, a new set of drawing pencils and a sketchbook. She placed them on the table in front of Abinna and said, in a voice that brooked no argument, "You are still an architect, Abinna. Even if you never build another skyscraper, you must draw the world as you see it now, or you will drown in the world as it used to be." He looked at the pencils, their sharp tips reminding him of the precision he had lost, and felt a sudden, violent urge to throw them against the wall. But then he looked at Amara, at the dark circles under her eyes, the calluses on her hands, and the unwavering love in her gaze, and he realized that his refusal to draw was not an act of penance, but an act of cowardice. He picked up a pencil, his hand trembling, and made a single, jagged mark on the white paper. It wasn't a building, it was a line, a small, fragile connection between the man he was and the man he might become if he could only find the courage to try. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a voice from the past that sounded like silk and smelled like corruption. It was Shegan, a man Abina had once considered a rival, but who had survived the purges of the industry by being more clever and less visible. Shegan offered a meeting at a quiet, high-end hotel on the island, a place Abina hadn't visited since his fall. When they met, Shegan laid out a proposition that felt like a lifeline and a noose at the same time, a ghost consultancy for a new government project that required a set of forged environmental impact reports. The pay was more money than Amara could make in 5 years of catering, a sum that could move them out of the mainland and back into a life of comfort and anonymity. All Abina had to do was sign a different name and use his expertise to hide the same kind of structural rot that had destroyed his own career. "Nobody has to know it's you," Shegan whispered, sliding a thick envelope of cash across the table, "and once the money clears, you can be anyone you want to be again." Quote, Abina sat in the air-conditioned luxury of the hotel bar, the familiar scent of expensive leather and imported cigars triggering a primal longing in his gut. He looked at the envelope, feeling the weight of the potential salvation it offered. The chance to stop Amara from burning her hands, the chance to buy back his dignity, the chance to stop being a ghost. But as he looked at Shegan's smiling, predatory face, he saw the mirror of his own past arrogance, the same belief that the rules didn't apply to those who were clever enough to break them. He thought of the Sector 4 collapse, the image of the compromised steel bars that haunted his dreams, and the weight of the lives he had almost extinguished. He realized that this wasn't a way back up, it was a way further down, a deeper basement that would eventually swallow him and Amara both. He pushed the envelope back across the table, his hand steady for the first time in months, and walked out of the hotel without saying a word, leaving the money and the temptation behind in the cold, artificial air. When he told Amara about the meeting and his refusal of the money, he expected her to be angry, to remind him of their unpaid bills and her aching back. Instead, she sat him down and wept, not with sorrow, but with a profound, soul-deep relief that he hadn't seen in her since before the arrest. "I didn't stay with you because of the money, Abina," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I stayed because I knew the man you were before you became a brand. If you had taken that money, the Abina I loved would have stayed dead forever." In that moment, the last of his pride finally crumbled, replaced by a raw, painful honesty that felt like skin being grafted onto a wound. He realized that his true, great fall wasn't the loss of his penthouse or his career. It was the loss of his integrity, and that by rejecting Shegan's offer, he had made his first successful structural repair. They sat together in the small, hot kitchen, the smell of Amara's baking flour surrounding them like a blessing, and for the first time, the mainland didn't feel like a prison, it felt like a training ground. This rejection marked a turning point in Abina's recovery. He began to help Amara with the business, not as a silent partner, but as an active participant. He used his logistical skills to organize her delivery routes, he designed a more efficient kitchen layout using his knowledge of space and flow, and he even began to handle the accounts with a transparency that was almost religious in its detail. He was no longer trying to be the golden boy, he was content to be the man who washed the flour off the floor and made sure the deliveries were on time. The neighbors began to see a change in him, the big man, arrogance replaced by a quiet, hard-working humility that slowly earned their respect. He was building a new reputation, one based on the quality of his character rather than the height of his buildings, and although the work was hard and the rewards were small, he found that he slept better in the two-room flat than he ever had in the penthouse. The news of the pregnancy came in the middle of a particularly difficult month, a month where the generator had broken down and the cost of flour had doubled. Amara handed him the positive test with a mixture of joy and apprehension, her eyes searching his face for the panic she expected to see. Abina felt a surge of terror that nearly knocked him off his feet. How could they bring a child into this cramped, noisy life? How could a man who had failed so spectacularly be a father? But as the initial shock faded, it was replaced by a sense of purpose that was more powerful than anything he had ever felt in a boardroom. This child wouldn't be the heir to an empire of glass and lies, this child would be the first generation of a life built on truth and resilience. He looked at Amara, her belly still flat but her spirit already expanding to accommodate the new life, and he felt a fierce, protective love that made his previous ambitions look like children's toys. He doubled his efforts to find honest work, scouring the newspaper and visiting small construction sites on the mainland where his name wasn't a headline but his skills were desperately needed. He found that without the ego of the star architect, he was actually a much better engineer. He noticed the small details, the quality of the mortar, the angle of the drainage, and the safety of the workers. He began to offer his services to local landlords for a fraction of his former fee, helping them fix leaning walls and leaking roofs with a precision that stunned them. He was no longer building monuments to himself, he was building shelters for his community. The pregnancy became the heartbeat of their home, a ticking clock that reminded Abina that he didn't have much time to create a world that was worthy of his child. He worked until his hands bled and his muscles screamed, but every naira he brought home was clean, and that made it feel like gold. Abina eventually secured a job as a site supervisor for a small, struggling construction firm that built modest bungalows for middle-class families. The salary was barely enough to cover their expenses, and he had to report to a man who was 15 years younger and significantly less talented than he was. The young manager, aware of Abina's past, took a perverse pleasure in assigning him the most grueling tasks, counting bags of cement in the hot sun, supervising the manual mixing of concrete, and climbing scaffolding in the pouring rain. Abina accepted it all with a silence that the manager mistook for weakness, but which was actually the ultimate form of strength. He was learning the language of the earth, the way the sand felt between his fingers and the way the sun dictated the pace of the work, gaining a ground-level understanding of his craft that he had completely missed in his years behind a computer screen. He was no longer an architect in the abstract, he was a builder in the literal, sweat-stained sense of the word. He found a strange, unexpected camaraderie with the site laborers, the coolers, who carried the weight of the city on their heads for a pittance. They didn't care about his scandal or his former penthouse, they only cared if he treated them with respect and if he knew how to make a straight line. He began to teach them the principles of structural engineering during their lunch breaks, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick, explaining the why behind the how. In return, they taught him how to endure the heat, how to find joy in a cold bottle of water, and how to laugh at the absurdity of a life that could take everything from you but your soul. He realized that these men were the true foundation of the country, and he felt a deep shame for how he had once looked down on them from his ivory tower. By the end of his first 3 months, he was no longer the guest on the site, he was the heart of it, a man whose presence made the work better and the day shorter. The moment of ultimate testing came on a Tuesday morning when a group of high-end investors visited the site to inspect a nearby luxury development. Among them was Tunde, his former junior partner, the man who had taken over Abina's firm and rebranded it after the scandal. Tunde stood in his perfectly tailored suit, his Italian leather shoes stepping delicately around the puddles of muddy water, pointing at the horizon with the same arrogance Abina had once worn like a second skin. When Tunde saw Abina, standing in his sweat-soaked overalls with a clipboard in his hand and a layer of cement dust on his brow, he stopped mid-sentence and burst into a loud, mocking laugh. "Look at the great Abina!" Tunde shouted, loud enough for all the laborers to hear, from building the silver wing to counting bags of cement in a gutter. Is this the architect of the future, or just a common laborer? The silence that followed was heavy, the site workers looking at Abina with concern, waiting for the explosion they knew he was capable of. Abina felt the old heat rising in his chest, the familiar urge to lash out and remind Tunde that he had more talent in his pinky finger than Tunde had in his whole body. But as he looked at Tunde's smug, empty face, he felt a sudden, profound sense of pity. Tunde was still trapped in a world of glass and lies, a world where your value was determined by the opinion of people who didn't love you. Abina took a deep breath, the smell of damp concrete filling his lungs, and gave Tunde a small, polite nod. "The foundation is solid here, Tunde," Abina said calmly, his voice steady and devoid of malice. "I hope yours is too." He then turned back to his workers and gave the order to start the pour, completely ignoring Tunde's subsequent insults. As he watched the concrete flow into the forms, he realized that he had just passed the most difficult structural test of his life. He was no longer a slave to his reputation, he was a free man. As Amara's due date approached, the tension in their small apartment became an almost physical presence, a mixture of excitement and a deep, lingering fear. One night, as they sat together in the quiet darkness, the only sound a rhythmic whir of a cheap plastic fan, Abina finally apologized. It wasn't the superficial, "I'm sorry," he had offered after the arrest. It was a comprehensive, soul-bearing confession of every lie, every compromise, and every moment he had valued his ego over her peace. He told her about the forged documents, the grade B steal, and the absolute terror he felt that their child would inherit his character flaws. "I was a hollow building, Amara," he whispered, his head resting on her shoulder, "beautiful on the outside, but built with a foundation of sand. I spent my whole life trying to be great, that I forgot how to be good." He wept then, the tears washing away the last of the golden boy, and leaving behind a man who was finally ready to be a father. Amara held him, her presence a sanctuary that had survived the fire and the flood, her love the only constant in a world of variables. "The foundation isn't what you build when things are easy, Abina," she said, her voice a soothing balm for his wounded spirit, "it's what remains when everything else is stripped away. You've spent the last 2 years rebuilding yourself from the ground up, and this time, you used the right materials." They talked until the sun began to peek over the horizon, planning a future that didn't involve skyscrapers or gala dinners, but a life of honest work and a home filled with the kind of truth that doesn't crack under pressure. Abina realized that Amara hadn't just stood by him, she had been the master architect of his redemption, guiding him through the demolition of his old self so that something permanent could be built in its place. He fell asleep that morning feeling lighter than he had in a decade, a man who had finally found the blueprints for a life that wouldn't collapse. The emergency began at 2 a.m. on a Friday, a sudden, violent onset of labor that caught them both off guard. Amara's face went pale, her hand gripping the edge of the table as a contraction ripped through her with a force that made her gasp for air. Abina sprang into action, the years of site management and emergency drills kicking in with a calm, focused intensity. He hailed a rickety yellow taxi, the only vehicle available in the sleeping neighborhood, and held Amara in the back seat as they sped toward the public hospital through the potholed streets of the mainland. The hospital was a scene of controlled chaos, overcrowded, underfunded, and smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. As he watched Amara being wheeled into the labor ward, the doors closing between them, Abina felt a sense of powerlessness that was more profound than his bankruptcy. He couldn't engineer his way out of this, he couldn't bribe the biology or negotiate with the pain. He sat in the waiting room, a cramped space filled with other men, some pacing frantically, some sleeping on the hard plastic chairs, and some huddled in groups, praying for success and wealth for their unborn children. The atmosphere was thick with the traditional expectations of Nigerian fatherhood, the desperate hope that this child would be the one to lift the family out of poverty or cement their status in society. Abina listened to their prayers, men asking God for sons of gold, daughters of beauty, and lives of ease, and he felt a strange, disconnected sensation. He looked at his own hands, scarred by cement and calloused by labor, and thought about the life of ease he had once enjoyed and how it had nearly destroyed him. He realized that the greatest danger to his child wasn't the poverty of the mainland, but the poverty of the soul he had once possessed, and he knew that his prayer had to be different. As the hours dragged on, the reports from the nurses became more concerning. The baby was in distress, and Amara's blood pressure was spiking dangerously. The other men in the waiting room, sensing his distress, gathered around him, offering the kind of generic comfort that usually fills such spaces. "Don't worry, brother," one man said, patting him on the back, "God will give you a champion, a child who will bring money and pride to your house. We are praying for a smooth delivery and a wealthy future." Abina looked at the man, a well-dressed fellow who reminded him of his former self, and saw the same preoccupation with success that had been his own undoing. These men were praying for a destination, but Abina was focused on the journey. They were praying for the building, but he was praying for the foundation. The contrast between their aspirations and his reality was so sharp it felt like a physical pain in his chest, a realization that he had traveled so far from the world of status that he could no longer speak its language. The head nurse came out, her face etched with the weariness of 1,000 long nights, and told Abina that they were preparing for an emergency C-section. "It's going to be difficult," she said, her voice low and serious. "You need to pray now more than ever." The other men immediately began a loud, rhythmic chorus of "Amen" and "God is able," their voices rising in a cacophony of traditional petitions for health and prosperity. They expected Abina to join them, to add his voice to the demand for a blessed child who would conquer the world. But Abinah walked to the corner of the room, away from the noise and the expectations, and knelt on the cold, dirty linoleum floor. He closed his eyes, the images of his fall and his redemption flashing behind his eyelids, and he began to speak to the God he had finally met in the ruins of his life. The room went silent as the other men stopped their chanting to listen, curious about what a man who had lost everything would ask for in his most desperate hour. Abinah's voice was a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the waiting room, it sounded like a thunderclap. "Lord," he began, his voice cracking with an honesty that chilled the air, "do not give me a son of gold. Do not give me a child of ease or a child of status. I pray, Lord, that you give this child trouble. Give him the kind of trouble that will break his pride before it can harden. Give him the kind of failure that will force him to look for you. Do not let him be successful until he knows how to be kind. Do not let him be powerful until he knows how to serve. God, I pray that his life is difficult enough to make him strong, and painful enough to make him honest. Do not let him be the man I was, make him the man I am still trying to become." Quote, the other fathers stared at him in horrified silence, their prayers for wealth and smoothness hanging uselessly in the air. To them, his prayer was a curse, a shocking betrayal of the basic instincts of fatherhood. Who prays for trouble for their own child? But Abinah didn't care about their judgment, he was speaking to a higher architecture. He knew that a building without wind testing is a building that falls, and a life without struggle is a life without a soul. He was asking for a child who would be storm-proven, a human being built with the grade A steel of character rather than the grade B steel of convenience. He stayed on his knees long after he finished speaking, his heart finally at peace, knowing that he had just designed the most important structure of his life, a legacy based on the truth of the struggle rather than the illusion of the triumph. The sun was beginning to rise over the Lagos skyline, a soft, pink light filtering through the dusty windows of the hospital, when the nurse finally returned. She was carrying a small, bundled shape, her face softened by a genuine smile that cut through the tension of the room. "A boy," she whispered, handing the child to Abinah, "and he's a fighter. He had a difficult start, but his heart is as strong as anything I've ever seen." Abinah held his son, feeling the incredible, fragile weight of the new life against his chest, and he saw in the boy's tiny, wrinkled face the answer to his prayer. The child wasn't a champion, or a prince, he was a survivor, a small piece of humanity that had already endured his first storm. Amara was awake and recovering, her eyes shining with a tired, triumphant joy when she saw the two of them together, the man who had fallen and the boy who would learn how to rise. A few weeks later, Abinah received a letter that didn't come from a lawyer or a debt collector. It was an offer from a non-profit organization that built schools and clinics in the rural parts of the country. They had heard about his site-level expertise and his new reputation for integrity, and they wanted him to lead their construction department. The salary was modest, and the work would be hard, but as Abinah looked at Amara holding their son in their small, clean apartment, he knew he was the richest man in Lagos. He had a career he could be proud of, a wife who had proven that love is the only permanent structure, and a son who would grow up knowing that a good life is much better than a great one. They were happy, not with the hollow, brittle happiness of the penthouse, but with the solid, enduring joy of the mainland. The architect of the future had finally finished his masterpiece, a home built on the rock of a prayer that shocked the world, but saved his soul. Would you pray for your child to struggle if it was the only way to save their soul? Tell us your truth in the comments. If this story shifted your perspective, save it and follow for more narratives that cut deeper than the surface.